Senior Technology Manager. And what does that mean? It means that, well, we do a lot of things, but one of the key things is we look for patent license opportunities. So I hope that, I think actually what would be really informative is to pull back the curtain a little bit on TechLink's process, since we have a lot of c-trac here, and give a perspective on how we look at the DoD technology and then how we move through that process. And so what I have today is really a 6-step process that from start to finish in terms of looking at how to license the DoD technology. But also know from the perspective of TechLink how sometimes we start and we do our own evaluation of the technology. And I'll go into that a little bit, and also provide some resources that I think would be beneficial to share with you so that we know what we're doing. I think the key thing that I like to let companies know, from my perspective, if I'm marketing to companies, if I really want to get excited about the opportunity, is I explain that there's a lot of money being spent on innovation. So this is taxpayer-funded research that's available for industry and private companies to participate in and collaborate and potentially license. And with that type of message, we find that there is some opportunity, once we start to educate the company about it, that instead of having them reinvent the wheel or spend that own research and development, they can see if it's already been done or if there's a way that they can leverage it. Additionally, I think that there are really intelligent and smart people that are working in the research labs. And so as a private company, if you're looking at hiring a PhD scientist or engineer as part of your staff, that can be very expensive to the bottom line. Is you staff up and you're spending on that. Where if you do a license opportunity and create you might be able to leverage the expertise of that scientist as part of your product development without actually having to hire the person. So in some cases, what I like to do is I let people know that they potentially have access to technology that's pennies on the dollar, that they don't have to spend if you take a look at that. And I think one of the things that we know is the ideas that are coming out of the Department of Defense labs are getting productized. Some of the top defense contractors are using DoD inventions. They may not be doing the licenses, but they are doing tech transfer, because we know the DoD, from our perspective, they're not a manufacturer. They need somebody to do the manufacturing for them. And so there's this wide supply chain. And we also look at 2 things at TechLink. We're also know that there's tech transition. So we know that there are companies that would do the technology development if they knew that there was a purchase on the back end. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the DoD. One of the license opportunities that we put together with a colleague of mine was a hardened trailer for storage and shipping. So when you're out in high-risk locations, you can have this as a secure container. The Department of State was interested in purchasing that. So we did several non-exclusive licenses with a company that then had the right to make that hardened trailer that they then can go after requests for proposals to offer that to various countries as well as the Department of State to sell that. So now you're getting sort of a pseudo-indirect tech transition where it's not necessarily going back to the DoD, but it is going back to a government agency. The other reason that as tech transfer, that when we go into the scientists and engineers and we encourage them to continue to patent, is because we found that, particularly with the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Crane, Indiana, they found that they could save themselves and show that they were delivering value back to the Department of Defense based on intellectual property and patents. And so by increasing that, they then basically saved the base. And so as part of the base realignment and closure, we're seeing more labs integrating themselves with the local community. So we know that it's the best mechanism to get this technology out of the lab. Otherwise, it's left and it collects dust on the shelf. And while some of the patents don't have any value, they're just part of the process. There are some that have quite a bit of value, and in fact, some new technology out of the Army is generating a lot of interest, and so I might cover that a little bit. I'm not really going to go into T2 legislation. There is not going to be an exam on it. I think, though, we as tech transfer personnel, we need to understand where we have the authority, where the authority comes from. In fact, a lot of times we're always seeing these government exchanges, there's like per authority CFR 15.32. So the authority has to come somewhere. And what we like to say is two things. Bayh-Dole and Stevenson-Weigler were the two key legislation that does give us the opportunity to do technology transfer. PS. How many of you guys have heard PF? Know what it stands for? All right. So I don't need to go into that. I think what's interesting is how it stands for Partnership Intermediary Agreement, and yet it also has taken on a name as our role in tech transfer. That we have this identity as a PF. So here are the 6-step processes. We have select the technology, evaluate it, see if it's something that can be made into a business or help a business. And then we have, I think, 3 and 4 at TechLink, in my experience, go hand in hand when we work with industry companies that are looking to do a license with the DoD. And so I'll go into some detail about applying for the license, as well as putting together a plan that's necessary for the DoD to say, okay, yes, we're going to do this type of agreement. Negotiation, that's a very interesting one. That can take some time back and forth. TechLink, our role is we are neutral. So we give some advice, but we don't necessarily create the terms for the companies or the lab to agree. We leverage a database of historical license agreements, as well as help with some of the calculations to do a cash flow analysis to try to find the value of the potential technology for that. Step 6 is actually execution. That's not our role. The labs themselves are also marketing their technology. So they have, as a tool for tech transfer, as we engage with the labs, we can just make sure that their websites are up to date, that they have the information, and sometimes there's an opportunity to cross-market. So if the lab is interested in doing something and we can help promote that, and vice versa. All right, so I think the key thing with engaging with industry partners to license the technology is make sure that they've done their due diligence, that they have figured out what are all their questions answered, so that there's no concerns as we get down to the negotiation. Because at this point, really, from our perspective, is we want to weed out companies that aren't really interested and are not serious at this stage before they get to negotiation. And once we can find that out, then we can really make sure that we're working with the right companies. And so I don't know from your experience if you found that the researchers, for example, they're not really supportive of the T2 process. And so I think that sometimes is a key indicator if we're going to potentially do a license or not. If the inventor is not interested in doing it, they, in some ways, what I like to think, and you guys can also contribute, in some ways the company's not necessarily licensing the technology. They might be licensing the technologist and his technical know-how that's potentially not incorporated in the patent itself, but it's how to do the lab, it's how to set up the experiment, it's some things that he just understands. And so without the inventor involved with the process, you could feel that there's a lot more questions that the company has and they may not understand exactly what they're getting into. The other thing that a company might be interested in is if it's part of a larger portfolio, there's an opportunity to potentially do patent bundling. So instead of just one patent, they want to secure a whole portfolio set. So we look at that increases the value of the technology if there's multiple patents on the same thing. So as we do the technology evaluation, we look at those types of questions, as well as we try to pull in some additional information if there's some publications, if there's some additional experiments. For example, that hydrogen fuel cell example that was provided, what we're trying to gather is some basic experiments that they've done so that we can tabulate the information so that they don't repeat themselves with all the different companies that are interested in it. All right, so with the DoD, once the company has made that determination that they want to apply for a license, there's two things that we do at TechLink that helps that. One, each lab has its own application. Some are short forms, some are longer forms. They all ask basic information about the company, where's it established, what's the size of it. But we also ask and work closely with the companies on step 4, and I think those go hand in hand. And so step 4 is what we call the commercialization plan, but it's really a business plan. The application for a license asks questions that are related to what are your expected revenue, where are you going to manufacture it, and they want to make sure that it's being made potentially in the United States, who are the partners, what other companies are you going to be engaging in, and trying to figure out what's appropriate to disclose from a company standpoint. So we help them in terms of knowing that this is proprietary and this is not going to be shared with anyone else. So it's, we do have confidentiality agreements, so we share that with companies that we work with, that we're not going to share their proprietary information with other companies. You wouldn't want your competitors to know what your business plan is anyway, so we have that discretion. And so the application for a license and a commercialization plan is sort of the key step. I find historically that if a company completes a commercialization plan and they submit an application, that there's pretty good opportunity that it's going to be a closed license. So this becomes the key point. If a company doesn't do the work to put together the commercialization plan, because there is some work to it, that is a good measure of their seriousness. So that's another milestone for us. And we have, at TechLink, we have a pipeline, what we call it. We look at patents that we've marketed, and we look at patents that now potentially have a company evaluating it. And then we have this middle stage where now they have submitted a commercialization plan. And so then we can sort of track that as part of our process to see how many companies are interested, what do we think is the probability of that opportunity to come to fruition. So we start to give it a 50% chance that this might happen, and our idea is to try to get everything done within 2 years, from start to finish. So here's where we can get into some of the license agreements that we've done. The formal ones that are out there, of course, is a patent license agreement. And then there's a CRADA, we've mentioned that. So that's more an opportunity. It's called a collaborative research and development agreement. So now an industry partner and the lab are now working together. They each are providing something to the table. And so the CRADA then dictates that line. Like the company, this is what is the company's, this is what is the lab's. So we want to make sure we don't mix and start claiming each other's intellectual property. And then there's a statement of work, and that's the key thing in the CRADA. What is the goal of that collaboration, and what is going to be output? I find that the CRADAs lead to potential further licensing opportunities. But I believe that the labs themselves deal with a lot of CRADAs. And so that's an area that TechLink helps with, but we don't necessarily go out and try to look for CRADA opportunities. So after the CRADA, other arrangements that we've done is a customer evaluation. So there they don't necessarily have the right to make, use, or sell. They're just initially getting the hands on the material. It's also sometimes what we call the material transfer agreement. So that's another mechanism where a company can do its due diligence, and it's done through an agreement so that there's some control to that transfer of that material. And we've done those. We've also, education partnership agreements, I heard from the Army that they've done an excellent job working with the local school systems in the 3D manufacturing so that those companies have, the students have access to 3D printing technology, and then there's some potentially workforce training that's happening. So let's set the stage. So as Mike, as you talked about, you can get into the non-exclusive or an exclusive or the partial exclusive, which is really an exclusive agreement that's narrowed in terms of its field, its market application, maybe its geography. Now, here's the key thing is that in most cases, the Department of Defense patents are US patents, so they protect, make, use, and sell within the United States. Occasionally, they do a PCT filing and get international coverage. And so we might have a company that's in Israel that's interested in licensing the technology, but it's really given them protection within the United States if they want to sell or if they want to manufacture in the United States. That can have, obviously, impact on the value and the royalty negotiation of the patent. And it opens up the opportunity for other companies that are interested in a different market application. All exclusive licenses do need to be publicly announced. It's just like the wedding. Forever, if anyone object to this relationship, please raise your hand. And so there's that little window of time where people, if they do have an objection, can notify, and potentially, maybe they want to do a license, and they weren't even aware of it. So that's part of an exclusive license. Non-exclusives do not have to have that, for pretty obvious reasons. So an evaluation license, as I mentioned, they just want their hands on the material. They want to test and play with it. And in that case, it may be just the cost of purchase of the product. So they're just reimbursing the lab for the cost of that material. And we talked about the CRADAs. The U.S. Army is now looking at requesting a CRADA in addition to the license, because they understand that there is an opportunity for continued work, and there's other information that needs to be transferred. And so that type of transfer of knowledge and lab experiment work happens through the CRADA, because the patent license is really just the right to the patent, to make, use, and sell. So it's not really, they're using this new, the CRADA to actually help with the data transfer and the technical package. So we're finding that it sort of goes hand in hand. When you do a license, you also do a CRADA. And it's a win-win, though, in some ways for both, because they do get some preferential access to the technology before others. So, all right, now we've talked about the companies having them work on their commercialization plan. Have any of you helped companies write one? I think one of the areas that what I've done with TechLink is I will call a company and I'll walk through the commercialization plan. So that's something we can do, and then I ask the questions, and then I help complete the commercialization plan. There's only one area that I cannot help, and that's the pro forma. And the pro forma is our guidance at TechLink and others is just to be conservative in terms of your revenue estimates, because it's there's no advantage to go on the high end. Yeah, that's. But once we get to this point, this commercialization plan, then we move into the feedback. In most cases, the companies that are doing a commercialization plan, there's no problem. They are doing manufacturing, they're small business, it's favorable. They have a general understanding they understand that maybe the first couple of years there's not going to be any revenue. In fact, it's going to be some non-recurring engineering costs, so they're going to be in the red the first couple of years, and then potentially scale. So those all play a role in the evaluation of the terms, which is, I know, one of the things that we play. We help with that type of negotiation in terms of providing some of the resources that are available. And that, I know, is the key thing, negotiating an agreement. So since we've covered the first four, are there any questions in terms of the commercialization plan, sort of identifying those patents that are out there, finding companies that are interested or the company wants to do the license, and so we guide them through the application process as well as the commercialization plan. So those steps have to happen first before they even get to the actual agreement, which is a new document, which then sets out what it identifies the patents that they're going to license. It starts to identify where it's going to happen and the termination clause, sub-license clauses, etc. And then the terms and conditions for doing that license and where to make the payments. You know, some of those, that's all addressed in the agreement. So it's completely different than the application. And that becomes part of the negotiation process. And at certain labs, the legal is involved in the negotiation, and the T2 office is involved in that, and then you're working in between. And with those prospects that I'm working with, I'm helping with the negotiation in terms of just making sure that any changes are reported. So everyone has, hey, the company just made a modification to Section 7. Please take a look at that and see if you have any concerns. They've just addressed an additional manufacturing location, for example. They might get into some differences. And so that's part of the negotiation. The royalty and the valuation of that is a very interesting opportunity. I think as a tech transfer office, one of the things that I like to share is that the first $2,000 goes back to the inventor. And I know that in some of these business relationships, that's an important thing to know that it's the inventor getting the money and not going up into some bureaucracy. So I think that's a key selling point. One of the key things that we help the company to put together the terms is to know that there are some upfront costs. It's very difficult to not have a company put some skin in the game. And so the cost of those, sometimes, like I said, is $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 up front. It can be more, but there is some upfront. And so to set expectations to the company that there will be some initial payment at the execution of the license. Now, it could also be negotiated, like I said, if they do a non-exclusive license and the front end is some of those payments are postponed for 6 months so they can do an evaluation. But when they make the payment, they're part of a non-exclusive license. That's already been negotiated, so they don't have to go back after the evaluation and now say, okay, now I want to do a license. So that's sort of a strategy that we've looked at to help companies get involved. The 25% rule is this idea that an inventor should participate in the profits of his idea. And the 25% is this idea that the inventor is about 25%, and then the company gets 75% in terms of the royalty. Now, how does that break down? Depending on the business model of the company, it sometimes seems that the 5% of gross revenue does, if you run through and you look at the profit of the business, it turns out that about that 5% of revenue as a royalty is very close to 25% of the profit. And so that's some of the initial starting royalty rates that we've looked at in industry. It depends. Software's higher in terms of royalties, and really expensive commercial development of stuff, the royalty rates will be lower because there's not as much profit in the business. And we have access to a database that looked at all historical licenses. We also look internally. And some of the labs have expectations that we have to take a role. So the Navy, for example, had higher upfront fees that they were expecting. And the Army may not have. They just want to get back some of the costs of the prosecution of the patent. That's really all they're concerned about. And one of the things that helps determine the 25% rule and the 5% royalty or whatever it is potentially do a discounted cash flow analysis based on that pro forma. Then you look back and you can find the net present value of the profits and make a determination. And the upfront fees, minimum royalties is an interesting one where even if they're not meeting their expectations, there's still a minimum fee that they're paying each year within the license that they have. And again, the idea there is that we don't want companies that get into a license but then don't create the product. So they're not executing. So if there's a minimum royalty, that's an incentive for them to develop the technology and try to get it to market. So those sometimes can be part of the negotiation process. Are there minimum royalties each year, even if the company is not developing it? All right, can you believe that we're in the home stretch?
Goes by fast.
That you can talk about how to license a DoD technology for 2 hours. But I hope that there's key questions with this audience, and if there's any time for question, I'll have that, because we're pretty much at the end. I just wanted to highlight that not only TechLink's also helping some of the DoD labs do pre-negotiated terms for express licensing, and so that's part of our website. So there, it's usually technology that is more mature, but it's also potentially maintenance fees are coming up, so we're looking at that. But we're not limiting ourselves to express licenses for those type of patents, but I think the opportunity is to try to expedite the whole licensing process. And so pre-negotiation is sort of key to that, because that can back and forth can take a while. And it's really now up to the companies to be successful. Last thing, exit strategy. I think the key thing is that as a company, we have to make them ask those questions and try to negotiate in the opportunity, like if they want to sell, what does it take in terms of approval, and do they lose the license? Will the license transfer? And those are just some key questions, because I think when we work with businesses, we have to accept the fact that businesses will want to sell, they want to get acquired, the person wants to retire. And so these are key things that we have to think about when we get into a patent license. And we always tell them to work with their attorney to get that nice clause, an exit clause in there. So with that, that's really the step-by-step